Raymond Calder had been a man who arrived early to everything. Board meetings, his children's school plays when they were small, and when he still believed that showing up was the same as being present. The quiet hours before his staff came in, when the building was his alone and the work felt like his own again rather than a thing that had outgrown him and continued under its own momentum regardless of whether he was there to watch it. He had built this habit of earliness over 47 years the way he had built everything else in his life, one morning at a time, one decision at a time, with the steady, unremarkable discipline of a man who understood that large things are made of small things and that the small things are all you can hold. He arrived at the offices of Calder Industrial Group at 6:40 on a Tuesday in mid-October, 20 minutes ahead of his usual 7 o'clock, because he had not slept well and the apartment on the 31st floor of the Meridian building felt, as it sometimes did in the hours before dawn, too large for one person and too quiet in the specific way of spaces that have never quite filled themselves back up after the person they were built around is gone. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. That person had been Eleanor, his wife of 38 years. She had died of pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2019, and Raymond had spent the 5 years since organizing his grief into the same categories he organized everything else, into tasks and schedules and the demanding forward motion of a company that employed 4,200 people across 9 states and did not slow down for anyone's private interior weather. He was 72 years old. He had white hair he rarely had cut on time and the particular posture of a man who has been strong for a very long time and now carries that strength as something he can no longer set down even when he wants to. He made his own coffee in the small kitchen off the executive floor, a habit he had maintained since the beginning when there was no one else to make it, and which he had kept not from stubbornness but from the genuine pleasure of doing one small thing himself in a life that had progressively outsourced its small things to other people. He stood at the window with the mug held in both hands and looked at the city below, still mostly dark, the October morning light not yet committed to anything. He was thinking about the quarterly review scheduled for Thursday, which his son Marcus had been supposed to prepare and which had arrived in Raymond's inbox the previous evening incomplete, 3 days late, missing the segment on the Western Division contracts that Raymond had specifically asked for twice. He was thinking about this, about the particular quality of Marcus's unreliability, which was not carelessness exactly but the more specific failure of a man who believed things would resolve themselves if he waited long enough, when the pain arrived. It came from the center of his chest and moved outward with a speed and authority that left no room for negotiation. He had heard people describe a heart attack as a fist. That was not quite right. It was more like a weight, open and pressing from inside, measured and total, saying clearly, "This is serious, this is not something you are going to manage." He set the mug on the windowsill. He did not spill it. He was a man who had spent 50 years not spilling things and the muscle memory held even as everything else was becoming unreliable. He sat down on the floor, which was not a decision so much as a concession to the reality of his body, and he reached his phone from his jacket pocket and called 911, and he said his name and the floor number and the address in the calm voice of someone who has made difficult calls before and understands that what the person on the other end needs is accurate information delivered without additional drama. The dispatcher asked him to stay on the line. He said he would. He leaned against the glass partition and looked at the city below and thought about Eleanor, which was not an unusual thought in a crisis because Eleanor had been the person he thought about in crises for 38 years and the habit had not broken just because she was gone. He thought about her laugh, the deep, unself-conscious one that came when something genuinely surprised her. He thought about the last conversation they had before she lost the ability to speak clearly, which had been about nothing in particular, which had been about what she wanted for lunch, and which he would give everything he had ever built to have back for 5 minutes. The October light was coming through the windows now, low and sideways and the color of old brass. He had always liked October mornings. He thought that, specifically, standing on the edge of consciousness, and then he did not know anything for a very long time. He had been born Raymond Ellis Calder in Harlan County, Kentucky in 1952, the second of 4 children, in a house that sat at the end of a dirt road that became impassable in the wet months, which in Kentucky was most months. His father had worked the mines until the mines had no use for him, at which point his father had discovered bourbon in the serious way of a man with too much time and not enough purpose, and the family had reorganized itself around that discovery with the quiet, exhausting efficiency of people who have no other option. Raymond had left at 17 with a Greyhound ticket purchased with money saved from 3 years of after-school work at a hardware store, and the clear cold understanding that leaving was not abandonment but survival. He had carried the guilt of that distinction his entire life without being fully able to set it down, which was perhaps why he had employed more people than he strictly needed in the early years and why he had never, not once, laid anyone off without a severance package he could barely afford at the time. He built the company slowly, specifically, with the patient attention of someone who understood that you could not skip steps. Calder Industrial had started as a one-man contractor operation in Columbus, Ohio, in 1977. When Raymond was 25 and working out of the back of a truck, he had bought with a loan from a credit union that had required him to explain himself 4 times before they were satisfied. He did structural metal work. He was good at it. Not because he had been trained formally, which he had not, but because he was the kind of person who could look at a structure and understand its logic, who could read a blueprint the way some people read a language, intuitively and with pleasure, seeing not just what was there but what was possible. By 1983, he had 8 employees and 2 trucks and a lease on a small industrial space on the west side. By 1991, he had the 14th floor of the building where he would collapse 40 years later. By 2001, Calder Industrial had its first $100 million year. He had called Eleanor from his car that evening, sitting in the parking garage because he needed a moment before going home to process what the number meant, and she had said, "Ray, come home. The number means come home." He always had when she said it. Eleanor had been the center. Not in the way that people meant when they said things about behind every great man, which was a formulation she would have found both inaccurate and faintly insulting. She was not behind him. She was the person he thought with. The person whose judgment he had borrowed so completely, and for so long that he had not understood how much of his own confidence was hers until it was no longer available to be borrowed. When she was diagnosed, he had been 66 and had thought, with the arrogance of a man who has solved most things he has turned his attention to, that this was a problem he could solve. He was wrong in the specific and humbling way that men who have never been unable to solve something are wrong when they finally meet the thing that will not be solved. He had 3 children. Marcus, who was 44, had been at the company for 11 years in a succession of roles that had grown more senior in title, without any corresponding growth in Marcus's actual capacity for the work. Raymond knew this and had known it for years and had continued to adjust Marcus's responsibilities downward while adjusting his title upward, which was the kind of compromise that resolved nothing and told the truth about nothing, and which Raymond had maintained because confronting it directly would have required a conversation he had spent years finding ways not to have. Marcus had his father's height and his mother's coloring and a manner that had always reminded Raymond of a man playing a version of confidence rather than possessing it, which was not an uncommon thing in people who had grown up in proximity to someone who possessed the real thing. He spent money with the ease of someone who had never had to understand where it came from, which was accurate, and he had been married and divorced twice before he was 40, which was information Raymond held without comment because the commenting had never improved anything. His daughter Diane was 41 and had married a man named Gordon Ashby, who wore very good suits and had an MBA from a school he mentioned with a frequency that corresponded precisely to how rarely his judgment proved sound. Gordon worked in finance and had spent several years positioning himself as an informal advisor to Raymond with the patient sideways persistence of a man who understood that the direct approach would not work and that proximity was its own form of influence. Raymond had never liked Gordon. He had accepted him the way he accepted materials he did not prefer but which the situation required, which was with the specific resignation of a man who understood the limits of his own authority over other people's lives. Diane herself was sharper than her husband, and Raymond knew this even if she did not always seem to. She had her mother's organizational intelligence and a talent for the management of appearances that Eleanor had possessed without ever having needed to deploy as a strategy. Eleanor's appearances had simply been accurate. Diane's were more carefully constructed, and the construction showed if you knew what you were looking at, which Raymond did. His youngest, Thomas, was 38 and lived in Portland, where he ran a nonprofit focused on literacy programs for people who were incarcerated. This was the only thing any of his children did that Raymond admired without reservation, which Thomas knew nothing about, because Raymond had never said it. This was one of the failures of his fatherhood that he carried with the same weight he carried the others, which was heavily and without the comfort of being able to fully explain why he had not simply said the thing when saying it was still available to him. He had told himself it was because praise from a father who had rarely offered it would be received as condescension or pity. He was not sure this was true. He suspected it was the story he told himself to avoid the exposure of saying it. Eleanor had been the one who maintained the connections. She had remembered the birthdays and organized the holidays and held the family in the shape of a family through the decades when his attention was pointed elsewhere. When she died, the shape had held for approximately a year and then had quietly come apart at the edges, not with any one argument or definitive break, but with the gradual separating of people who had been bonded through a common center and who, without that center, discovered they did not have enough of their own reasons to hold together. He had not known how much of what he believed about his family was actually about Eleanor until he was facing it without her. Clara Torres had been a night nurse at Mercy General Hospital for 11 years, working the overnight cardiac unit since 2019, the year she had made the decision to move to nights because her daughter Sophia required a level of daily care that made a predictable daytime schedule impossible. And the overnight shift was the only arrangement that let her be home before the school bus came in the morning. Sophia was 15 and had been diagnosed with juvenile idiopathic arthritis at 8, the kind that did not behave as straightforwardly as the name suggested, the kind that spread its effects in ways that required regular specialist appointments and a medication regimen that had to be adjusted every 6 months and that cost, after insurance, approximately $800 a month. Clara paid this with the same careful arithmetic she applied to every other expense in her life, the precise and unglamorous mathematics of a woman who knew exactly what she had and what she needed and how little margin existed between the two. She had been doing this arithmetic for 7 years without making it anyone else's problem, which was not because she felt no weight under it, but because she had been raised by a woman who believed that complaining was a form of spending energy you could not afford, and she had inherited this belief along with her mother's hands and the specific grace of someone who moves through a difficult world with their spine straight and their eyes forward. She was from Guadalajara originally, had come to the United States at 20 with her then-husband Ernesto, had gotten her nursing license at 28 working toward it while raising a baby and managing a household on one income, had divorced Ernesto at 31 with the quiet resolved practicality of someone who had looked at the full picture and understood that the cost of staying was higher than the cost of leaving, and had been managing entirely alone since then with the help of her sister Maricela, who lived 20 minutes away and watched Sophia on nights when Clara's shift ran over. Clara worked 4 nights a week, 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning. She knew every patient's chart by the time she came on, and she knew the difference between the chart and the person, which was a distinction that not everyone in her profession maintained and which she considered the essential distinction of the work. The chart told you what was happening to the body. The person told you what was happening to the human being, which was always something additional, something the chart could not hold. Raymond Calder came to her unit on a Tuesday morning in mid-October, admitted through the ER after the cardiac event at his offices, stabilized in the ICU and transferred to her ward on the 3rd day when the situation had settled enough to permit the move. He was in what the attending cardiologist, Dr. Priya Nehru, described to the family as a medically induced coma to allow the heart muscle time to recover from the acute event. The prognosis she gave was guarded, which in medical language means deeply uncertain and potentially very bad, which was the word the family heard and which set into motion a particular kind of response that Clara observed from her first night with Raymond and did not yet know what to make of. The first family member she met was Marcus Calder. He arrived on the Wednesday evening, the second night of Raymond's stay on her ward, at 9:15, which was outside visiting hours. He had the particular manner of a man accustomed to rules applying to other people and was therefore mildly confused when Clara explained the policy. He was tall, wearing expensive casual clothes that communicated wealth without appearing to try, which was its own kind of trying. He said he had driven 2 hours from Cincinnati. Clara said she was sorry about the drive and that he was welcome to return at 9 in the morning. He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. He asked to speak with whoever was in charge. Clara said she was the charge nurse on this shift. He asked if there was anyone above her. She said the attending was Dr. Nehru, available for medical questions, and that she herself was available for anything related to patient care. He looked at her for another moment and then he said, quietly, the performance dropping out of his voice, "I just want to know how bad it actually is." And Clara heard in those words something that was not strategic, something that had to do with a father lying in a room he had not been allowed to enter and with the specific helplessness of a situation that money and rank could not resolve. She said she would ask Dr. Nehru to call him first thing in the morning with a full update. He left. He did not say thank you. She did not note the absence of it for any particular reason. She simply filed it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Diane arrived the following afternoon during visiting hours with her husband Gordon beside her and a manner Clara had learned, over 11 years of this work, to recognize as composure deployed for purposes other than grief. She asked the correct questions and thanked the nurses by name and stood at her father's bedside for 12 minutes before Gordon touched her elbow and said they needed to make some calls. She nodded and they left. 12 minutes was not a number Clara tracked deliberately. It was a number she knew because she had been in and out of the room during that time, and time on a unit like hers was something you tracked with automatic precision whether you intended to or not. What she noticed was not the 12 minutes. It was what happened in the hallway after the door closed, before the couple had moved far enough from the nurse's station for privacy. Gordon said something in a low voice. Diane said something back. The words Clara heard, because she was charting at the station 8 feet from where they stood, were these: "We need to be talking to Richard Okafor by the end of the week." Richard Okafor was the name listed on Raymond's intake forms as his personal legal representative. Clara filed this without comment, the way she filed everything she saw in rooms and hallways that were not quite private enough. Thomas came alone on the Friday, having flown from Portland, and he was the most different from what she expected. Slighter than his siblings, quieter in his movements, he arrived at the beginning of visiting hours and stayed until they ended, sitting in the chair beside the bed with his father's hand between both of his, not performing anything, simply present in the honest, unglamorous way of someone who has decided that presence is what the situation requires and is not looking for acknowledgement of the decision. He said once to his father, in a voice that was not directed at anyone else in the room, "I know you probably can't hear me, but I want you to know the program in Portland got the grant. The big one we applied for 2 years ago. I was going to tell you at Thanksgiving." He paused. "I don't know why I keep waiting to tell you things." Clara was checking monitors on the far side of the room, and she moved to give him the privacy he had not asked for, because he did not appear to know he deserved it. She worked with Raymond 4 nights a week. She talked to him the way she talked to all her unconscious patients, directly and without the self-conscious hesitation that some of her colleagues brought to the practice, as though they feared seeming foolish talking to someone who could not respond. She had been doing this long enough to believe that what happened in those rooms was real in ways she could not quantify and was not going to stop doing just because she could not quantify it. She told him about the city outside, about the October weather which had turned colder. She told him his vitals were steady. She told him once, on the 5th night, about Sophia's appointment with the rheumatologist that she had attended that morning before her shift, that the medication adjustment had been approved and that Sophia had asked that afternoon whether she could join the school drama club. She said it the way you say something when a room is quiet and you are sitting next to another person and the ordinary human need to share something good is simply present, requiring nothing more. She did not know who Raymond Calder was beyond what the chart told her. She knew his name because it was on the chart. She did not know that the name corresponded to the 14th floor of a building on 3rd Street or to 4,200 employees across 9 states, or to a net worth that would have been difficult to make real to her even if she had known it. She knew a man in a bed who needed careful watching and who had 3 children who visited with varying degrees of presence, and a sister in Cincinnati named Ruth and who called the nurse's station twice a day, and who always said please and thank you and who always asked for the nurse's name before she said anything else. Ruth Ann was the one who first mentioned that arrangements were being made. She said it on a Tuesday, the 9th day of Raymond's stay, at the end of Clara's shift. She said, "The family wants to be prepared." She said it in the voice of someone who has made peace with a hard thing and is now in the administrative stage of that peace. Clara expressed condolences and said the attending was the best source of specific prognostic information. Ruth Ann said she knew, and then she said, "He would have liked you, I think. He always liked people who were straightforward." Clara did not know what to do with that. She said she would pass it on to the daytime team. Ruth Ann said thank you. She always said please and thank you. On that same Tuesday during afternoon visiting hours, Diane stopped at the nurse's station and left a business card with a contact number regarding the management of the patient's personal belongings in the event of his passing. Clara looked at the card after Diane had gone. She thought about the timing of it. She put it in her pocket and went back to her work. What happened on the Thursday of that week was not something Clara had anticipated, or that Dr. Nehru had projected on any particular timeline, or that anyone else in the life of Raymond Calder had prepared themselves for. He woke up, not with the drama of the films, not with a sudden open-eyed return to full consciousness, but in the gradual disoriented way of someone coming up from deep sedation, layer by layer, like surfaces rising through water. His hand moved first, then his eyes opened partly, then closed, then opened again. Clara was at the station when the monitor shifted and she was in the room within 30 seconds and she said his name the way she said everything directly without performance. He looked at her. His eyes were not focused yet. They were doing the work of finding the room and finding her face and finding the concept of being awake again after a very long time of not being awake. She said, "Mr. Calder, my name is Clara. I'm your nurse. You're at Mercy General Hospital. You had a cardiac event 11 days ago. You're going to be all right." She said the last part because it was true, because Dr. Nehru had told her that morning the recovery had tracked better than initially projected, and because it was what people needed to hear when they woke up in rooms they did not recognize with the specific fear of someone who has lost the thread of their own life. He said one word in a voice rough from the tube and the time. He said, "Eleanor." Clara was quiet for a moment. She said gently, "Eleanor isn't here. Is there someone you'd like me to call?" He did not answer immediately. He was still finding the room, finding the ceiling, finding the gray November light through the window. When his eyes settled, they were clearer. He said, "How long?" She said 11 days. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were fully present. He said, "My children, were they here?" She said yes. She said Thomas had come every day. He waited. He was the kind of man who heard what you selected as much as what you said. She said Marcus had come twice and had called regularly. Diane had visited several times with her husband. He said, "And what else has been happening while I was under?" She said she was not sure what he was asking. He said, "The family has been making arrangements." It was not a question. Clara was quiet. She thought about Diane's card in her pocket. She thought about Richard Okafor's name in the hallway. She thought about what arrangements implied about what the family had assumed and how quickly they had assumed it. She said, "I think Dr. Nehru is the right person for any medical planning conversations." He said, "I'm not asking about medical planning." The room was still. He said, "There's going to be a service, isn't there?" Clara met his eyes. She said, "I don't have specific information about that. I know your family has been responding to what the doctors told them, which was that the situation was serious." He looked at the window. She could not fully read his expression. It was the expression of a man rearranging something large in his understanding of the world. She had seen versions of it before in patients who woke to news that had gathered while they were away, and she had learned that the rearranging needed time and that trying to assist it was the wrong form of help. She said, "Pain level 1 to 10. He said 3. Then he said, "What day is it?" She said Thursday, November 7th. He was quiet. Then he said, "I want to ask you something. I want you to tell me the truth even if the truth is not easy to give." She said she would. He said, "How serious has this actually been? Not what you've told my family. What is true?" She said the first 72 hours had been critical and that the recovery since had tracked better than the initial prognosis suggested. She said Dr. Nehru could give him the complete picture and that she was going to contact her immediately. She said he was not going to die today. She said it plainly because he had asked plainly. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, "I heard you, while I was under. Not clearly, not all of it, but your voice." She said nothing. He said, "You talked about your daughter, Sophia." Clara looked at him. She felt something move through her chest that was not embarrassment exactly, but the feeling of something private being received by another person and of not yet knowing how to stand in that. She said, "I'm sorry if that was inappropriate." He said it wasn't. He said it with the flat certainty of someone past the point of social pleasantry. Then he said, "She got into the drama club." Clara said yes. "Rehearsals started Monday." He said good. He looked at the ceiling. Then he said, "Tell Dr. Nehru I'm awake, but tell her I'd like an hour before anyone calls my family." He paused. "I'm not asking you to break protocol. I just need to think." She told Dr. Nehru immediately per protocol and conveyed his request. Dr. Nehru said she would be there in 20 minutes, that Clara should begin the standard waking assessment, and that the family notification was the attending's prerogative to manage, which gave Raymond approximately the window he had asked for. Clara went back to the room. She took his vitals, which were within the range of a man whose heart had been badly frightened but had decided to continue. She noted the numbers. She checked the 4. She did what was hers to do. And Raymond Calder lay in the bed in the November light and thought. She did not know exactly what he was thinking. She would learn more of it later. But she knew from the quality of his silence, from 11 years of sitting with people in the most unguarded moments of their lives, that the decision forming in him was not a small one. She was right about that. Raymond was discharged from Mercy General 8 days after he woke. Technically against Dr. Nehru's preferred timeline, which was another 2 weeks of monitored recovery. But he was legally competent to make his own medical decisions, which he was, and Dr. Nehru was a physician who respected that word legally and who had extracted from him a written agreement about medication compliance and follow-up appointments before she signed the paperwork. He agreed to every term. He meant it. He did not call Marcus. He did not call Diane. He called Thomas, who answered on the second ring, and told him he was awake and had been for 8 days and was sorry for the delay in calling. Thomas was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Dad." He said it the way you say one word when there are too many words behind it. Raymond said he was all right. He said the prognosis was good. He said he wanted to talk when Thomas was ready, but that there was something he needed to do first and that it was going to sound strange and that he needed Thomas to trust him. Thomas said, "Is this something I should be worried about?" Raymond said no. He said it was something he needed to understand. He said, "There's a memorial service planned for this Saturday, at the Dunmore Hall on Riverside Drive." Silence. Then Thomas said, "Dad, I want you to know I wasn't part of planning that. I told Marcus and Diane it was premature and they—" Raymond said, "I know." He did not know all of it. He knew enough. "I'm not calling to discuss that. I'm going to go." A longer silence than the first. Thomas said, "You're going to your own memorial?" Raymond said yes. Thomas said, "Why?" Raymond said, "Because I want to know who I've been to these people. Not the version they give me in a room where they knew I was listening. The version they give when they believe the room is empty." Thomas was quiet for a long time. Outside, the November wind pressed against the windows of the extended stay hotel on Finley Street where Raymond had checked in under the name Ellis, his middle name, his father's first name, the first name that came to him and that would appear on no credit card anyone was tracking. Thomas said finally, "And if what you hear is bad?" Raymond said he supposed he would need to know that too. Thomas said, "I'm going to come." Raymond said no. He said Thomas's presence in the room would change what happened, and what he was trying to hear was what happened in his absence. He said, "You came every day, Thomas. You sat with me and you talked to me and you didn't ask for anything in return. You've told me the truth about yourself for years without waiting for me to make it convenient. That matters to me." He paused. "I'll call you after." Thomas said okay. He said it the way someone says okay when they disagree but understand that the disagreement is not theirs to enforce. He said, "Please take your medication." Raymond said he would. He said he would call Saturday evening. Thomas said he would be there. He hung up. He sat on the edge of the hotel bed in the particular stillness of a man preparing for something he cannot fully prepare for. He had 8 days of lying in a hospital bed behind him, 8 days of rearranging his understanding of the world and the people in it. He was not afraid of the rearranging. He had been through it before. What he was afraid of, in the quiet, honest way he had learned to be afraid of things, was that what he heard on Saturday would not be a surprise. That was the real fear. That he had known the truth about his family for a long time and had chosen not to look at it directly. That Eleanor had been the one holding the frame steady around a picture that had always been wrong, and that without her the picture had simply become what it always was. He was a man who had spent decades choosing not to look at things he already knew. He was going to stop doing that. Saturday was 4 days away. He had 4 days to be ready. He thought about Clara Torres, who had talked to him in the dark of a room where no one else came at 3 in the morning, who had told him about her daughter's drama club with the simple directness of someone who had stopped waiting for the world to make space for her good news and had decided to put it in the room anyway. He thought about her voice. He thought about 11 days of unconsciousness and the specific quality of that voice, which had not asked anything of him and had not required anything from him and had been present without agenda, the way very few things in his adult life had been present without agenda. He thought about what a man does with 72 years and a company that employed 4,200 people and a fortune that had stopped feeling like anything specific a long time ago, when the person he would have given it all to is gone. He thought about what Eleanor would say if she could see him sitting in a hotel room under a name that was his father's, preparing to walk into a room full of people who believed he was dead, to hear what they had always thought of him. He thought she would say, "It's about time, Ray." She would say it without cruelty. She had never been cruel. She had simply been accurate. It was about time. He went to bed. He took his medication at 9 o'clock exactly, the way he had agreed to, because he was a man who honored agreements even when no one was watching. Especially then. The 4 days were not idle. He spent them the way he had always spent time when he was preparing for something that mattered, which was by making himself accurate about it. He walked the streets of the neighborhood around the hotel in the November cold, wearing a hat he had bought at a CVS and a coat that was not his usual coat, both of which he purchased with cash, and he tried to think clearly about what he was doing and why. He was not a man given to dramatic gestures. The entirety of his life had been organized around the opposite principle, around the steady accumulation of real things built through real work, and he was aware that walking into his own memorial service carried a quality that might seem like performance. He sat with this for a long time on the second day in a diner on Markham Street that he chose because it had a counter and the kind of coffee that was made in a large industrial pot and poured without ceremony, and he decided that the difference between performance and necessity was this: performance was about the audience. What he was doing was about himself. About the finally and completely honest accounting of a life that he had spent a great many years not examining with the rigor he examined everything else. He had examined his balance sheets with rigor. He had examined his contracts with rigor. He had built systems of accountability into every part of Calder Industrial that required the numbers to be what they actually were and not what anyone wished them to be. He had never once applied this discipline to his own family, to his own role as a father and a man with relationships that mattered, and he understood sitting at the counter in the diner on Markham Street in his CVS hat that this was not an accident, that the rigor had not accidentally missed the most important things, that he had arranged it that way because the most important things were the ones whose honest accounting he could least afford to face. Eleanor had known this. She had said it to him once, not unkindly, in the last year of her life when she was past the point of soft peddling things she needed him to hear. She had said, "Ray, you built something real. You built something that will last. But the people who needed you to build them something too, you left them in the corner office waiting for a meeting that never got scheduled." She had said it and he had heard it and he had told her she was right, and then she had died and he had turned back to the company because the company was the thing he knew how to hold and the other things were the things he didn't, and by then it was late and the late had become later. On the third day he called his personal attorney, a woman named Sandra Chu who had been handling his affairs for 22 years and who picked up on the first ring and said, without preamble, "Are you alive?" He said yes. She said, "I assumed. I didn't say anything to anyone." He said he needed her to do something for him before Saturday, a review of certain documents, and she said she would. She asked no further questions. This was why he had employed her for 22 years. On the fourth day, Friday, he sat in the hotel room in the afternoon and thought about Clara Torres. Not the way he thought about an investment or a problem. The way he thought about a fact that had arrived in him and had not left. She had sat with him in the dark for 11 nights and had talked to him about her daughter's doctor and the cold outside and the things that were ordinary in her life, and she had done it without any awareness that it was notable or that it deserved anything in return. She had done it because it was what she did. Because the work was the work and the work was seeing the person and responding to what she saw, and she did not stop doing that at 3 in the morning when no one was watching and there was no one to evaluate the quality of the doing. He had spent 50 years building things and had employed thousands of people and had written checks for various charities over the years with the reliable but ultimately impersonal generosity of a wealthy man who has people to manage that portion of his life. He had never in all of that given anyone the specific thing that Clara had given him without knowing she was giving it, which was the experience of being seen by someone who had nothing to gain from the seeing. He understood, sitting in the hotel room on the Friday before his own memorial, that this was the rarest thing. He understood that he had spent a lifetime accumulating everything else and had somehow missed this one thing entirely. He was going to fix that, not as payment, not as transaction, but because the woman who talked to a man in a coma about her daughter's drama club deserved to know that the words had landed somewhere and had mattered. First, though, Saturday. He went to bed. He took his medication at 9 o'clock exactly, the way he had agreed to, because he was a man who honored agreements even when no one was watching. Especially then. Saturday was coming. He would be there before anyone expected him to be, which had always been his way. The Dunmore Hall sat on Riverside Drive like a building that had decided, sometime in the 1980s, exactly what it was and had seen no reason to reconsider since. It was red brick and white trim and the kind of understated grandeur that wealthy Columbus families associated with occasions that required a room large enough to feel significant without feeling ostentatious, which was a distinction that mattered a great deal to a certain kind of family and which Raymond had always found faintly absurd. He had been inside it twice, both times for other people's events, and he had thought both times that it was a room designed to make grief feel appropriate, which was not the same thing as a room that actually helped with grief. He arrived at 9:40 in the morning, which was 1 hour and 20 minutes before the service was scheduled to begin. He came by taxi, which he had called from the hotel, and he told the driver to drop him half a block from the entrance on the side street, which the driver did without comment in the way that taxi drivers in any city accommodate the small eccentricities of fares who pay without argument and tip well, which Raymond did both. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the November cold. He was wearing the coat he had bought on Thursday, a dark wool one from a department store on High Street, unremarkable and nothing like the coats he actually owned, and the hat from the CVS, and he had not shaved since leaving the hospital, which had given him a beard that was almost entirely white and which altered his face enough that the doorman at the hotel had not recognized him from the day before. He was also thinner than he had been in October. 11 days in a medically induced coma and another 8 days of hospital meals had taken approximately 14 pounds from him that he had not asked to lose, which had the effect of making him look simultaneously older and less immediately recognizable as himself. He had noticed this in the hotel bathroom mirror on Friday morning and had felt something that was not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it, the specific reassurance of a man who is about to do something that requires not being immediately placed. The hall's main entrance was already open. A young woman in a black blazer was arranging programs on a table in the foyer, and a man in a dark suit was directing the placement of an easel that held a large photograph of Raymond, taken at a company gala in 2017, in which he was wearing a tuxedo and smiling in the specific way he smiled for photographs, which was correctly and without warmth. He had never liked that photograph. Eleanor had told him once that he looked in it like a man who had been informed at the last moment that smiling was expected and was doing his best under the circumstances. She had been right. He walked past the photograph without slowing. The woman at the program table looked up and said, "Good morning. Are you here for the Calder Memorial?" He said yes. She handed him a program. He took it without looking at her directly and moved into the main hall. The room held 300 seats arranged in curved rows facing a stage with a podium and 2 large screens currently displaying a looping series of photographs. He stood at the back and looked at the photographs while the room was still mostly empty. Calder Industrial's first building, 1983. A groundbreaking ceremony, 1991. A company picnic, sometime in the 90s. Eleanor in a white summer dress laughing at something off camera. A handshake photograph with the mayor of Columbus in 2003. His face at various ages doing the various things his face was photographed doing, which was the usual public record of a man who had spent 50 years becoming a version of himself that was designed for observation. There was one photograph he did not recognize, which was the one that stayed with him. It was taken from a distance, apparently without Raymond's awareness, and it showed him standing at a workbench in the original Franklin & shop in 1979 or thereabouts, in a flannel shirt with his sleeves rolled up, looking at a piece of metal he was holding up to a work light. He was 26 or 27 in the photograph. He looked like a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. He could not remember who might have taken it. He chose a seat in the last row on the far left, which put him against the wall and gave him a clear view of the room and the stage and the first several rows where family would presumably sit, without placing him in anyone's direct line of sight unless they turned all the way around. He sat down. He put the program on his knee. He waited. He thought, sitting there in the last row in a coat that was not his and a hat from a drugstore, that this was perhaps the strangest thing he had ever done. He had done strange things in his life, things that required a specific kind of nerve that was not courage exactly but more like the willingness to be in a situation that others would find untenable and to remain composed within it. He had driven to a bank in 1979 with a blueprint under his arm and borrowed money. He had no obvious means of repaying. He had fired a man who had been his friend since childhood because the business required it and the friendship did not survive it, and he had made that choice with his eyes open. He had sat at his wife's bedside for 11 days at the end and had not looked away from what was happening. He was familiar with the kind of nerve it took to remain in a room where remaining was the hardest option. This was different. He was in a room designed around the assumption of his absence, and the room had organized itself accordingly, and what he was doing was observing the organization. He was watching people be exactly what they were when they believed no one who mattered was watching. He understood this was information he would have to live with afterward, whatever form it took. He had decided that knowing was better than not knowing, regardless of what there was to know. He was not sure Eleanor would have agreed. She had sometimes said to him that knowledge without the capacity to use it was just another form of pain. He thought he had the capacity to use it. He was about to find out. The room filled between 10:30 and 11, which was the way rooms filled for these events, in clusters and fragments, the people who came early and the people who arrived at the last permissible moment and the people in between. He watched them come in and recognized some faces and did not recognize others and registered all of them with the particular attention of someone who has made a study of reading rooms. There were people from the company. He recognized his CFO, Janet Marsh, who came with the head of operations and 2 division managers he had worked with for over a decade. They sat together in the middle section and they had the specific quiet of people who are genuinely uncertain about the future, which was a different quality from grief and from the performance of grief, and which told Raymond something about what had happened in the building on 3rd Street in the 19 days since his collapse. There were people from the neighborhood, from the Franklin years, men and women in their 60s and 70s who had known him before the 14th floor and the company galas and the mayor's handshake photograph. They came in 2s and 3s and sat near the back and spoke to each other in the low voices of people attending an event that is also a reunion. His sister Ruth Ann arrived at 10:50 with her husband Gerald and their son James, and Raymond watched her come through the door and felt something he was not going to name because naming it would require him to look at it directly, and he needed to be clear-eyed for the next hour. Ruth Ann was 68 and had their mother's eyes and the posture of a woman who has spent her life standing up straight because standing up straight was the thing she could always control when everything else was variable. She was wearing a black coat he had not seen before, and she looked, from the back of the room, like someone who had been crying recently and had made herself stop. She took a seat in the 3rd row. Marcus and Diane arrived at 10:58, 2 minutes before the scheduled start, with Gordon at Diane's side and Marcus's current girlfriend, a woman named Petra whom Raymond had met exactly once, at a dinner the previous Christmas. They came through the side entrance rather than the main doors, which meant they came in from the left, which meant they did not pass the back row, which meant Raymond watched the 4 of them take their seats in the reserved front row without any of them looking in his direction. Marcus was wearing a suit Raymond recognized as new, which was not notable in itself but which Raymond noted anyway because Marcus had chosen to buy a new suit sometime in the 19 days since his father's collapse, and this told Raymond something small and specific about how Marcus had been occupying his time. Gordon had a leather portfolio under his arm that he placed on his knee when he sat, which was the kind of detail that told Raymond everything about Gordon that he had suspected since the Christmas dinner when Gordon had brought a printout of Calder Industrial's most recent annual report to a family dinner and had worked it into the conversation 3 separate times. Thomas was not in the front row. Raymond scanned the room and found him sitting alone in the 5th row, slightly to the right, separated from his siblings by the empty seats that had been left between. He was wearing a gray suit that did not look new, and he was looking at the photographs on the screens with the quality of attention of someone who is doing the work of remembering a person rather than the work of being seen to remember them. Raymond looked at his youngest son for a moment. He looked away. A minister named Reverend Calder opened the service at 11 with remarks that were warm and generic in the way of ministerial remarks about someone the minister did not know personally, which he acknowledged directly, which Raymond appreciated. He said that Raymond Calder had been a man who built things, which was the thing that was easiest to say and also, Raymond thought, the truest. He said the building of things was a form of faith, that it required the belief that the future would be there to hold what you made. He said this without making it too elaborate and moved on, which was the right choice. A video played for 4 minutes. It was well produced. It had music underneath it that was the correct temperature of somber, and it moved through the photographs on the screens and added others, and it ended with the image of the Franklin shop in 1979, the one with Raymond at the workbench that he had not recognized, and Raymond sat in the last row and watched himself at 26 looking at a piece of metal in a work light and felt the distance between that man and this one as something physical, something with weight. The first speaker was a man named Arthur Graves, who had been Raymond's first employee, hired in the spring of 1978 when the company was 14 months old and Raymond could not afford him and hired him anyway because Arthur knew how to do 3 things Raymond did not and the work required all 3. Arthur was 71 now and he walked to the podium with the deliberate care of a man whose knees were not what they had been, and he adjusted the microphone with both hands and looked out at the room. He said, "I'm not going to tell you about the company. The company is in the program and in the video and you can read about it anywhere. I'm going to tell you about the man." He paused. "In 1981 my wife had a health scare. We thought it was bad. Turned out it wasn't. But we didn't know that for about 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Ray Calder told me to take whatever time I needed and continued to pay my salary. We had 4 employees. He couldn't afford to do that. He did it anyway and he never mentioned it afterward." He looked at the podium for a moment. "That's the man. The rest of it is numbers." He sat down. The room was quiet in the specific way of rooms where something true has just been said and people are sitting with it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Marcus went to the podium next. He was a good speaker. This was one of the things Raymond had always acknowledged about his son, that he had the gift of seeming present in a way that reached people, a warmth in his voice and his manner that communicated itself across rooms. He stood at the podium and looked out at the guests with an expression of composed grief and began. He said his father had been a man of enormous vision. He said the company was his father's legacy and would continue to be his legacy under the stewardship of people who understood what Raymond had built. He used the word stewardship twice. He talked about the Western Division expansion that was currently in progress, which was the expansion that Raymond had approved but had been having significant reservations about for 6 months and which Marcus had been pushing for and which the board meeting Raymond had discussed with Sandra Chu would need to revisit. He mentioned his own role in the company 4 times in 9 minutes. He said his father had believed in him, which was true in the way that parents believe in their children, which is differently from the way board members and investors believe in executives, and Raymond wondered if Marcus understood the distinction. Near the end, Marcus said something that Raymond had not expected. He said, "My father was not easy to know. He was not a man who said things like love easily or often. I spent a long time being angry about that. I think I spent so long being angry about it that I missed the ways he was saying it differently." He paused. Something moved through his face that was unperformed. "I don't know if I'm right about that. It might just be the thing you tell yourself." He looked down at the podium for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to try to do better than that." He walked back to his seat. Raymond sat in the last row and did not move. He was thinking about what Marcus had just said. He was thinking about the space between what Marcus had said and what Marcus had been doing in the hallway outside his hospital room when the name Richard Okafor came up. He was thinking about whether those two things could both be true at once, which they could, which was the particular difficulty of people who were not simply one thing or the other, which most people were not. Diane was more composed at the podium than her brother and also, Raymond thought, more distant. She had prepared her remarks carefully, which he could see in the precision of the phrasing, and she delivered them with the controlled warmth of someone who has rehearsed the appropriate emotional register and is hitting it accurately. She talked about her father's determination, his work ethic, the lessons she had learned from watching him build something from nothing. She said he had set an impossibly high standard and that she had spent years either trying to meet it or resenting it for existing. She said she had recently come to understand that the standard was not about her, which Raymond thought was both true and incomplete. She did not say she had loved him. She said she had respected him enormously, which was a sentence that told Raymond everything it needed to and also several things it did not intend to. Gordon, in the front row, had the portfolio open on his knee during Diane's remarks. Raymond could see from the back of the room that he was writing something. He could not see what. The reception break came at 12:30. People moved from the seated rows to the side rooms where long tables held food and drink, and the quality of the room changed in the way it always changed when formal structure gave way to informal circulation, when people began doing the actual work of the occasion, which was finding the people they needed to find and having the conversations they had come to have. Raymond did not go to the reception. He stayed in his chair in the last row and watched the room clear and watched the staff move between the tables with quiet efficiency, and he waited. He was waiting for something specific, which was the behavior of people who believed themselves unobserved, which took approximately 8 minutes to emerge after the formal program ended and the room divided itself between the reception area and the small clusters of people continuing private conversations where they stood. He heard Marcus before he saw him. Marcus had moved to the left side of the room, near the tall windows that looked out onto Riverside Drive, and he was talking to Gordon in the low voice of someone who has found a corner that feels private enough. Raymond was 20 feet away on the other side of a structural column, and the room's acoustics did what the acoustics of large old rooms sometimes did, which was carry certain frequencies with more clarity than the room appeared to warrant. He heard Gordon say, "The board meeting Monday is already set. Janet Marsh is the question. She's going to push back on the succession structure." Marcus said, "Janet pushes back on everything. That's her job." Gordon said, "Her job is currently defined by your father's preferences, which is going to shift. The question is whether she shifts with it or becomes a problem." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She was his person from the beginning. She's good at what she does." Gordon said, "I'm not saying she isn't. I'm saying the company's direction is going to change and the people in senior positions need to be people who understand that." There was a pause. Raymond sat with his hands flat on his knees and his face entirely still and listened to the conversation that was happening 20 feet away between his son and his son's wife's husband about the company he had built over 47 years and the people he had trusted with it. Marcus said, "Let's not get ahead of Monday." Gordon said, "Monday is in 2 days. I'm not ahead of anything." A pause. Then Gordon said, voice dropping further, "The Western Division restructure alone is worth moving on immediately. Your father had been stalling it for 6 months. The numbers are there." Marcus said nothing. Gordon said, "Ray, this is what we planned for." There was a silence Raymond could not interpret. He could not see Marcus's face from where he sat. He did not know if what was happening in the silence was resistance or agreement or simply the expression of a man who has rehearsed a future and is now standing in it and finding it different from the rehearsal. He held the silence the way he held all information he could not yet use, carefully and without rushing to a conclusion. They moved away from the window then, back toward the reception room, and Raymond lost the thread of their voices in the general movement of people around him. He stayed where he was. He sat for another moment longer than he needed to, doing what he always did with things that mattered, which was letting them be what they actually were before he decided what to do about them. He had heard enough. He had also, in the same 30 minutes, heard Arthur Graves say he didn't go looking for recognition and Thomas say he saw the photograph and Ruthin choose the right music. He had heard his son, in a public room, say something about love that was unexpected and partly true. He was doing the accounting of all of it, the full honest accounting he had come here for, and the ledger was not simple. It had never been simple, which was why he had avoided it for so long. He looked at the large photograph of Eleanor that someone had placed on an easel near the stage. It was not one of the photographs from the video. It was one he knew well from 1998, at a company dinner. Eleanor in a blue dress at a round table turned toward someone to her left, her face mid-laugh. She had never liked posed photographs either. She had always looked more like herself when she didn't know someone was taking it. He looked at her for a moment. He thought, I know Eleanor. I know. Across the room, near the doorway to the reception, he saw a woman in her late 60s speaking to Arthur Graves. She was one of the people from the Franklin years, he thought, though he could not place her exactly. She was saying something to Arthur and Arthur was nodding and Raymond caught pieces of it across the room. She said, I just always thought he seemed lonely toward the end. You know? After Eleanor. Like he didn't know what to do with himself when he wasn't working. Arthur said something quiet in return. She said, he would have hated all of this. All these flowers. Arthur said, he would have hated the flowers, yes? And he smiled in the small private way of someone who has known a person well enough to know exactly what they would have hated. He would have been right about the flowers. Thomas went to the podium at 12:55, after the reception had largely returned to the main hall for the closing portion of the service. He had not been listed in the program as a speaker. Raymond saw him walk to the podium and saw the slight surprise on Marcus's face in the front row and saw Diane lean toward Gordon and say something. Thomas adjusted the microphone to his own height, which was 2 inches shorter than Marcus, and looked out at the room for a moment before he spoke. He said, I wasn't going to do this. I wrote something and then I decided it was too prepared, and then I almost didn't come up here at all. But there are things I need to say in a room where they can be heard, so here I am. He paused. He said, my father and I were not close in the way some fathers and sons are close. I spent most of my 30s being hurt about that and most of my mid-30s deciding the hurt wasn't useful and most of my late 30s trying to figure out what we actually were to each other, which turned out to be something I didn't have a simple word for. He looked at the back of the room while he was saying this. Not at any specific point, just at the general space at the rear of the hall. Raymond was very still. Thomas said, he came to the opening of our literacy center in Portland. In 2021, when I thought he didn't know what we were doing, didn't care what we were doing. He flew in without telling me and sat in the back row for the whole event and left before I could get to him. I found out afterward from one of our volunteers, who had taken a photograph of the audience. He was in the photograph. He was in the back row. A beat. That's what my father did. He showed up and he sat in the back and he didn't tell you he'd been there. Raymond's hands were flat on his knees. He was not looking at the podium. He was looking at the program on his knee, which he had not opened. Thomas said, I have been waiting my entire adult life for my father to say certain things to me, and I have had enough therapy to understand that waiting for people to say things they may not know how to say is a good way to be waiting indefinitely. So last year I stopped waiting. I called him. Not every week, but more than I had been. I told him things without making them a transaction, without making him do something in exchange for the information. I told him about the program. I told him about the grant. I told him I was doing all right. He stopped. He always said, good. He said it in this particular way where the word carried more than the word. I don't know how to explain it, but it did. Ruth, in the third row, had her hand over her mouth. Thomas said, I don't know what my father thought about the way he lived his life. I don't know if he looked at the end of it and felt that the things he built were worth what they cost. I hope he did. I hope that somewhere in him there was something that felt like enough. He looked down at the podium for a moment. I know what I wish I had said to him directly, instead of just the way I showed up and hoped he understood. I wish I had said, the way you sat in the back row and left before I could reach you told me everything I needed to know about the way you loved, which was quietly, and at a distance, and in the hope that I would see it without you having to say it. A pause. I saw it, Dad. I saw it. He walked back to his seat. He did not look at Marcus or Diane. He sat down in the 5th row with his eyes forward. The room was completely still. Raymond sat in the last row with his hands flat on his knees and his throat tight in the specific way of a man who has been holding something back for a very long time and has just been handed the exact thing he did not know he needed and has not yet determined what to do with it. His vision had done something at the edges that he was not going to attend to in a room full of people. He breathed. He breathed again. He became aware, through the careful act of breathing, that someone in the 3rd row had turned around. He knew who it was before he confirmed it, because the quality of the attention at his back was the specific quality of someone who has found exactly what she was not looking for. Ruth Ann was looking at him from the 3rd row with the expression of a woman whose heart has just performed a very complicated maneuver and has come out the other side of it still beating. Her eyes were full. She did not say anything. She did not move. She looked at him from 20 feet away across the quiet of a room that was beginning to stir again, and Raymond looked back at her, and he shook his head, once very slightly. A request. The most specific request he had ever made of her, which was to give him this, to let him be unannounced for another hour, to allow him the thing he had come here for, which was to know the truth about his life from a position where the truth was not being managed. For his benefit. Ruth then looked at him for a long moment. Then she faced forward. Gerald, her husband, patted her hand without looking up from his program. Raymond waited another 30 minutes. He listened to Reverend Collier's closing remarks, which were better than his opening ones, which sometimes happened when a minister warmed to the specific human situation in front of him rather than the general concept of it. He listened to a final piece of music, a recording of a string quartet playing something slow and exact that sounded to him like the kind of music Eleanor would have chosen, which meant that Ruth Ann had chosen it, because she knew what Eleanor would have chosen, which was one of the specific forms that love took when it outlasted the person who was its original object. He waited until the formal portion was over. He waited until the room had divided again into the small clusters of the post-service hour, the hugging and the hand-holding and the conversations that were now the real reason people came to these things. Then he stood up, which was easier than he expected given what his body had been through in the last 3 weeks, and he walked along the left wall of the room toward the side exit, moving at the pace of someone who has somewhere to be and is neither rushing nor drawing attention to not rushing. He was 3 steps from the door when he heard his name, not spoken loudly, not spoken to the room, spoken quietly from very close, in the voice of a small woman who had known him for 41 years and who was not, under any circumstances, going to be managed. He turned. Ruth Ann was standing 2 feet away. She had followed him down the wall without him noticing, which told him something about the specific and underestimated skill of his sister, which had always included the ability to move through rooms without calling attention to herself, a skill she had developed in childhood for the same reasons he had and which they had never discussed. She looked at him. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You are the most impossible man." He said, "I know." She said, "Are you all right? Tell me the truth." He said, "I'm getting there." He said it honestly. She looked at his beard, at the unfamiliar coat, at the hat. She said, "You look terrible." He said, "I lost 14 pounds. She said, "You needed to lose 14 pounds. That's not the point." Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not. She said, "Ray, what did you hear?" He said, "Enough." She said, "Thomas." He said, "Yes." She looked away from him for a moment at the room behind them and then back. She said, "He came to me last year. He asked me what you were like when you were young, before the company was anything. Before Eleanor. I told him things I hadn't thought about in 30 years. She paused. "He's been trying to know you for years, Ray. He's been doing it the only way he could find." Raymond said, "I know that now." She said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "I need some time to do it right. A few days. I need you to not say anything until I'm ready." He looked at her. "Can you do that?" She said, "I have been keeping your secrets since 1969. She said it without warmth, which meant she was going to do it. He said, "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment. His sister in her black coat in the side room of the Dunmore Hall, a woman who had called the nurse's station every morning at 7 and always said please and thank you, who had chosen the right music, who had spent 41 years in the radius of his life and had never asked anything from him and had never received anything like what she deserved. He said, "Thank you for the music." She understood what he meant. She said, "She would have wanted it." He said he knew. He kissed her on the cheek. He walked through the side door into the cold November air. He sat in the rental car in the parking lot for 11 minutes. He knew it was 11 minutes because he was a man who tracked time with automatic precision, and because the tracking of it was something to do while the rest of him was occupied with what was happening. He did not call Thomas immediately. He did what he had always done with things that mattered, which was to let them sit for a moment before he responded to them, so that the response would come from the part of him that was clear rather than the part that was shaken. He was shaken. He would acknowledge that privately and move forward. He called Thomas from the parking lot. Thomas answered on the first ring. Raymond said, "I heard every word," a silence that contained everything. Thomas said, "Dad." Raymond said, "I know. I should have said it long before this." He stopped. He started again. "I was in the back row in Portland. I left before you could see me because I didn't know how to be seen there. I have spent a very long time not knowing how to be seen in the places that mattered most." He stopped again. This was difficult in the way that honest things were difficult. He did it anyway. "I saw it on your face when you talked to the volunteers. I sat in the back and I watched you and I saw what it was that you had built, which was exactly what I never managed to build, which was a room full of people who were there because of something real." He was quiet for a moment. "I was proud of you in that room the way I have never been proud of anything in my life. I am sorry I left before I could say it." Thomas did not say anything for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was the voice of someone who has waited a very long time for a specific thing and is now in the presence of it and is trying to understand that it is actually happening. He said, "You saw the photograph?" Raymond said yes. Thomas said, "I kept it. I put it in my office." Raymond said, "I know I have a great deal still to say to you. I know it can't all happen on a phone call in a parking lot." He looked at the Dunmore Hall across the lot, at the cars and the people still filtering out, at the ordinary November sky above it. "Come to Columbus this week. Stay as long as you can. We'll talk the way we should have talked years ago." He paused. "I'll have Ruth Ann's cooking. She won't let me eat anything else until the cardiologist approves it." Thomas made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. He said, "Okay, Dad." He said Tuesday. Raymond said good. He said he would be at Mercy General Monday morning for his follow-up and would be free by noon. Thomas said he would be there by 1. He hung up. He put the car in drive. He thought about where he was going, which was where he had decided to go 3 nights ago in the hotel room after 4 days of thinking, which was back to Mercy General, not for his Monday appointment but for the appointment he was going to make for himself this afternoon, which was not a medical one. He had asked Sandra Chu during their Thursday call to run something for him. He had given her a name, Clara Torres, and the name of the hospital, and he had asked for her contact information, which Sandra had found through the hospital's general staff directory in approximately 6 minutes and had texted to him without commentary. He had the number. He had not yet used it. He drove to Mercy General because he wanted to see her in the place where she had done the work. Not because the location mattered logistically, but because it mattered in the way that the right setting for a significant conversation always mattered, which was that it told the truth about where the thing came from. He pulled into the visitor parking at 2:15 in the afternoon, a Saturday, and he sat in the car for a moment before going in. He thought about what he was doing. He thought about it with the same clear-eyed attention he had applied to everything over the last 3 weeks, which was the attention of a man who has recently understood, at some cost, the danger of not paying it. What he was doing was going to see a woman who had talked to him in the dark and had expected nothing from it and had received nothing from it and had gone on doing the work regardless. He was going to tell her what her work had meant to him, and he was going to ask if he could do something for her, not as payment, which would have cheapened the thing he was responding to, but as something more accurate, which was the response of one person who has been genuinely helped by another person and wants the record to be honest about it. He had spent 50 years writing checks for causes that were vetted by other people and that reached recipients he never met. He had spent 50 years building a company that employed thousands of people and had improved their material circumstances in real and measurable ways. He had done these things and they were real things and they were not nothing. But they were not the same as this. They were not the same as someone sitting next to you in the dark and talking to you as though your being there mattered, as though the conversation was worth having even when you could not answer. He got out of the car. He walked through the main entrance and took the elevator to the cardiac ward on the 4th floor, and he went to the nurse's station and asked for Clara Torres. The nurse at the station said, "She's on shift. Who should I say is asking?" He said, "Tell her it's the patient from room 412, the one who heard about the drama club." The nurse looked at him for a moment with the practiced neutrality of someone who has received stranger requests. She picked up the phone. He waited at the station. He stood the way he always stood when he was waiting for something that mattered, which was still, with his hands at his sides and his attention on the hallway where she would appear. She came from the far end of the hall 2 minutes later, still in her scrubs, with the unhurried efficient walk of someone who is on shift and has learned to move between urgency and non-urgency without losing the thread of either. She came down the hall and then she saw him and she slowed by 1 step, not stopping, just registering, and then she covered the remaining distance and stood in front of him. She said, "Mr. Calder." He said, "Clara." She looked at him, the beard, the unfamiliar coat, the 14 pounds. She said, "You should have come through the clinic. You're supposed to be seen on Monday." He said, "I know. I'm not here for that." She said nothing. She was waiting. He said, "I need to tell you something, and then I need to ask you something, and I want you to hear both things completely before you respond to either of them, because they go together and they won't make full sense separately." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "You should sit down first." She said it the way she said everything, directly, without performance. He sat down in the chair against the wall of the nursing station and she sat across from him on the chair the staff used during charting, and she folded her hands in her lap and she looked at him and she waited. He began. He told her the short version first, which took 4 minutes, and then he told her the longer version, which took 12, and she listened to both the way she listened to everything, which was with the full and unhurried attention of someone who was not composing her response while he was still speaking but was simply receiving what he said. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He told her that Calder Industrial Group employed 4,200 people across 9 states, and that he had built it from a one-man operation in 1977, and that the net worth attached to his name was a number he was not going to say in a hospital hallway because the number was not the point and had never been the point. He told her that for 19 days, while that company had existed in the world without him, he had been in a bed on this ward, and that the one person who had been present in the way he kept thinking about was the person who asked nothing from him and expected nothing from him and sat with him in the dark and talked to him about her daughter's drama club as though he were a person worth talking to. She had not moved. He said, "I am not telling you this to make what you did into a transaction. I am telling you this because what you did was real, and I believe the right response to something real is honesty." He looked at her directly. "I heard you every night. I don't know how much was clear and how much was just the presence of a voice, but I heard you. And what I heard was someone doing the work with the full weight of their attention, not because anyone was watching, not because it would improve their performance review, because that is who you are." Clara said, "Mr. Calder." He said, "Raymond." She was quiet. She said, "What is it you want to ask me?" He said, "I want to know about Sophia's medical situation, specifically, the costs, the medication, what the next year looks like. I want to do something specific and concrete, and I cannot know what the right thing is without knowing the specifics." She looked at him with the look he had seen on the faces of people who are being offered something and are trying to understand whether the offer comes with a cost they have not yet identified. She said, "Sophia is doing better since the October adjustment. But the cost is ongoing and the insurance reviews every 6 months and there is always the possibility they reclassify the coverage." She paused. $800 a month is what I am managing now. That number could go up." He said, "I want to establish a medical trust in Sophia's name, not a gift. A trust managed by an attorney that covers her medical costs for as long as she needs it, that cannot be touched for any other purpose, and that requires nothing from you in exchange. No employment, no obligation, No relationship that makes you feel the trust is contingent on anything you do for me. He met her eyes. It is not contingent. It is the acknowledgement of a specific debt I can actually name, which is, you saw me when I was nobody in that room and you responded to what you saw. Clara was quiet. The ward continued its quiet business around them. She said, I need to think about this. He said, of course. She said, not because I'm not grateful, because I have spent a long time making sure that the things I do for my daughter are things I've earned, and I need to understand how to hold this. He said, I understand that better than you might think. She looked at him. She said, I already knew who you were. I looked you up on the third night. A beat. It didn't change anything. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, why didn't you say anything? She said, because it wasn't relevant to the work. He sat with that. It was the most clarifying thing anyone had said to him in a very long time. He said, will you let my attorney contact you this week about the trust? She said, yes. Simply, the way she said everything that was true. Thank you. For Sophia. He said, thank you for the drama club. She made a sound that was halfway to a laugh, the involuntary kind that arrives before you've decided to let it. She stood and looked down at him and said, your follow-up is Monday morning, 9 o'clock. Don't eat anything heavy before the blood work. He said he would not. He stood. He said, one more thing. She waited. He said, the next time a patient tells you they heard you, believe them. They always hear you. She said she would try to remember that. She walked back down the hall and he took the elevator to the lobby and went out into the November afternoon. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 on Monday morning in the large conference room on the 14th floor of the building on 3rd Street, the same floor where Raymond had stood at the window with a coffee mug 6 weeks ago, before the October light and the pain and the long silence of the hospital. The meeting had been called by Marcus, listed on the calendar as an emergency succession planning session, and the 12 board members who filed in at 9:50 had received a briefing document prepared over the previous week, which Raymond had obtained from Sandra Chu on Sunday evening and had read twice before setting it aside. He arrived at 9:45. He used his keycard on the executive entrance, which still worked because no one had thought to deactivate it, which was information Raymond filed without particular bitterness. He took the elevator to the 14th floor and walked to the conference room and opened the door and went in. The room was set for 12. Janet Marsh was already there, which Raymond had expected, because Janet Marsh was always already there. She was 61 years old and had been his CFO for 16 years, and she looked up from the document in her hands when the door opened and she looked at him, and she did not make a sound for approximately 3 seconds, which for Janet Marsh was an eternity. She said, Raymond. He said, Janet. He sat down in his chair at the head of the table, the chair that had been his for 30 years and that apparently no one had yet thought to reposition, and he put his hands flat on the table and he waited. The board members arrived in the next 12 minutes. Each of them went through a version of the same 3 seconds that Janet had gone through, the stop, the look, the recalibration. 2 of them shook his hand. One of them, a man named Pereira who had been on the board for 9 years, and who had always reminded Raymond of someone who was waiting for a more important meeting to begin, sat down without saying anything at all, which Raymond thought was its own kind of honesty. Marcus and Gordon arrived together at 3 minutes to 10. They came through the door talking about something, and Marcus had his jacket over his arm and Gordon had the leather portfolio, and they were mid-sentence when they saw Raymond sitting at the head of the table and the sentence stopped. Gordon's portfolio hit the conference table with a sound that was louder than he intended. Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment. Raymond looked at him. He looked at his son's face, which was doing something complicated that Raymond read as the specific expression of a man arriving at a moment he is not prepared for and discovering, in the arriving, that he is also not as prepared to be unprepared as he believed he was. Raymond said, "Sit down, Marcus." Marcus sat down. He sat in the chair to Raymond's right, which was where he always sat, and he put his jacket on the back of the chair and he looked at the table. Gordon remained standing for a moment. Raymond looked at him. He said, "Gordon, you can sit down or you can leave. Those are the options available to you today." Gordon sat down. He sat 3 chairs from Marcus, which put distance between them that had not been planned and that told the room something about where Gordon's instincts went when the situation changed. Raymond looked around the table. He said, "I owe you all an explanation of the last 6 weeks, and I'm going to give it to you, and then we're going to talk about the company." He said this in the voice he had used for 40 years to open meetings, which was the voice of someone who has the full agenda in his head and the full intention of covering it, and which the room recognized and responded to the way rooms responded to it, which was by becoming attentive in the specific way of people who understand that the person speaking knows what they are talking about. He told them what had happened. He told them about the October morning and the cardiac event and the medically induced coma and the recovery. He told them about the decision to remain unannounced, not as explanation and not as apology, but as fact. He said, "I needed to understand something about what was happening in this company and in my family, and the way I chose to understand it is the way I have always understood things that mattered, which is by looking at them directly without giving anyone the opportunity to manage what I saw." He looked at Marcus when he said this, not with hostility, with the specific directness of a father who is done performing a comfortable distance. He said, "I attended my own memorial service on Saturday. The room was very still. I heard things I needed to hear, and some of them were not easy, and some of them changed my understanding of people I thought I knew in both directions." He paused. "I also heard something from my son Thomas that I should have said to him first and did not, and I am working on that." He looked around the table. "What I am going to do now is tell you what changes and what does not change, and then we are going to have the actual board meeting, which is going to look different from what was in the briefing document." He looked at Gordon. He said, "Gordon, you are not on this board and you are not an employee of this company, and you are not an informal advisor to this company as of today. If you have thoughts about Calder Industrial's future, you are welcome to share them with Diane, who is welcome to share them with me directly. That is the appropriate channel." He said it without raising his voice. "You're excused." Gordon picked up his portfolio. He left. The door closed behind him with the sound of a man who has been in too many rooms he did not belong in and has finally been correctly identified. Raymond looked at Marcus. Marcus was looking at the table. Raymond said, "Marcus." Marcus looked up. Raymond said, "I heard what you said at the service. The part at the end. I want you to know I heard it. A beat. I also heard the conversation by the window during the reception." Marcus did not look away. To his credit, Raymond thought he did not look away. Raymond said, "I am not going to take the company from you, but I am going to ask you to do something you have been avoiding since you came to work here 11 years ago, which is to be honest with me about what you actually want, not what you think I want to hear, and not what Gordon Ashby has decided is strategically optimal. What do you actually want from this company?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. The conference room was completely still. 12 people sitting around a table watching a father ask his son a question that should have been asked a decade ago. Marcus said, "I want to run the Western Division. Not the whole company. The Western Division. I know those contracts and I know those markets and I am good at the relationships piece, which is what that region needs right now." He stopped. "I am not the right person to run everything. I think I have known that for a long time and I kept waiting for you to say it so I wouldn't have to." Raymond looked at his son. He said, "Why didn't you say it yourself?" Marcus said, "Because you built all of this and I didn't want you to think I wasn't enough." The room held that for a moment. Raymond said, "You are enough for what you are actually capable of, which is real and specific and not nothing." He said it plainly, the way he had failed to say things plainly for most of Marcus's adult life. "The Western Division is yours if you want it. We'll talk properly about what that means this week." He looked at Janet Marsh. "Janet, you know what needs to happen with the succession structure. I want your recommendation by Wednesday." Janet said, "I've had it ready for 4 months." Raymond said, "I assumed you did." He said it with the tone of a man who has just understood the full value of something he underutilized, which was an uncomfortable understanding and which he was going to sit with rather than explain away. He said, "Wednesday." Thomas arrived in Columbus on Tuesday at 1:15, which was exactly when he said he would. He came to the hotel on Finley Street with a bag that suggested several days, which Raymond had not asked for and which was exactly what was needed. They sat at the small table in the hotel room with the November city in the window, and they talked for 4 hours in the way they should have been talking for years, which was directly and without the careful distance that had always lived between them. Raymond told him about Portland, about the back row, about all the times he had shown up and left before he could be seen, and what it had cost him to operate that way, and why he had kept doing it long past the point where it served anything. Thomas listened. He said, "I used to think you were indifferent. It took me until about 35 to understand you were afraid." Raymond said, "Of what?" Thomas said, "Of being wrong about yourself. Of finding out that what you built wasn't enough to make up for what you didn't do." Raymond was quiet for a moment. He said, "Are you still in therapy?" Thomas said yes. Raymond said, "It shows." Thomas said, "Is that a compliment?" Raymond said, "Yes." Thomas stayed until Friday. On Thursday evening they had dinner at a small restaurant on the short north that Thomas chose and Raymond paid, and they walked back through the November cold, and Thomas said, "You know Marcus is terrified of you." Raymond said, "I'm learning that." Thomas said, "He's not a bad person. He just became whatever shape he thought the space required." Raymond said, "I know. I made the space." Thomas looked at him. He said, "You're going to be all right, Dad." Raymond said, "Yes." He meant it in the specific grounded way of someone who has done the honest accounting and found something that was not triumph but was not defeat either. Something that was simply true. The medical trust for Sofia Torres was established on a Thursday in December. The same week Janet Marsh's succession recommendation was accepted by the board, and the same week Marcus flew to Phoenix to begin the work of the Western Division with the focused energy of a man who has been given the right room and knows it. Sandra Chu handled the trust documentation with the efficient care she brought to everything Raymond asked of her, and she sent the final paperwork to Clara with a note that said the trust was fully funded, irrevocable, and asked only that she accept it in the spirit in which it was offered. Clara called Raymond the evening she received it. She said, "Sophia wants to know if she can write you a thank you letter." He said, "I would like that very much." She said, "She's in the drama club play in March. It's a musical." A pause. "She asked me to mention it." He said, "I'll be there." Clara was quiet for a moment. She said, "You'll sit in the back row." He said, "I'll sit wherever Sophia wants me." The letter arrived 10 days later, in the careful handwriting of a 15-year-old who had been told that handwriting mattered. 3 paragraphs. The first explained who Sophia was. The second described what the arthritis felt like on a bad day, with a directness that reminded Raymond of her mother. The third paragraph said, "My mom talks about her patients sometimes without telling me their names. She told me once about a man who heard her talking in the dark when she didn't know anyone could hear. She said he heard about me, and I hope that somewhere in whatever he was going through it helped a little to know about normal things. I think it probably did, because when I'm having a hard night it helps me to think about normal things too. So thank you for being someone she could tell normal things to." Raymond read it twice at the kitchen table of the Meridian apartment, where he had returned in December after Ruth and drove up from Cincinnati and spent a week making it feel less like a building waiting for someone who was not coming back. She had moved Eleanor's photograph from the hallway to the living room, where it belonged, where you could see it when you sat down. She had stocked the refrigerator and argued with him about his diet for 4 days and left on a Sunday with the specific satisfaction of a woman who has done what was needed and has no patience for being thanked. He folded Sophia's letter along its original creases and put it in the kitchen drawer where he kept the things that mattered. He got up and made his coffee, himself, with both hands around the mug at the window, looking at the December city below, lit for the season, going about its business, full of the small, unglamorous, irreplaceable, ordinary lives of the people in it. He was 72 years old. He had white hair, he was getting cut on time, and a cardiologist who sent text reminders, and a son in Portland who called twice a week, and a son in Phoenix doing the right work in the right room, and a sister in Cincinnati who said please and thank you, and a trust in the name of a 15-year-old girl who was going to be in a musical in March. He had a company in the hands of people who could hold it. He had a chair at a 14th floor conference table that he sat in twice a week and left when the sitting was done, because the sitting was no longer the whole of him. He had learned finally, and at some cost, what Eleanor had been telling him for 38 years, which was that the building was not the builder, and the builder had a life to live outside the thing he built, and that life was not a consolation for the building but was the actual point. He thought, it was enough. It was more than enough. He went to work. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.